Bon Jovi, everyone. Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where, yes, today we're talking about Bon Jovi because their absolute smash hit album, their breakthrough, if you will, Slippery When Wet, came out on this day in 1987. So, what made John Bon Jovi just click so well with radio listeners and record buyers and young Americans and young people around the world in the late 80s? Well, unless you're releasing an album in the middle of a national disaster, people will always want to party. People will always want to have something they can pump their fist to, sing along to, and be carefree. And no one captured that better in the late 80s than John Bon Jovi and the rest of the guys. They were one of those hardworking New Jersey bands that really could play. They were the real deal, even though a lot of people at the time on the more sort of hardcore end of the rock spectrum thought, too much hair, too much makeup, too overly produced. And sure, that was all true, but that's what people wanted. But they were a real hardworking band, and they knew how to play, and they wrote all of their own hit material, which is saying something. This album alone had three giant hits. Living on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive, You Give Love a Bad Name. Come on, hit after hit out of hit. And this was not by any means their first album, it was their third. And so they had a sort of slow ride to the top, but once they got there with Slippery When Wet, they really stayed on top for a long time, and that album remains their quintessential album. Now, Bon Jovi was one of those bands that was almost made to be killed by the 90s. It was as if a lot of bands from the 60s continued to have longevity into the 80s. I would say most of the big bands, except for the ones that broke up for personal reasons, had success into the 80s, either the early 80s or the end of the decade. Just think about it. The Eagles ended in the early 80s, but they could have gone on, and Glenn Frey and Don Henley and Joe Walsh continued to have hits in the 80s. The Doobie Brothers retired in the 80s as a band, but they were selling out real big arenas well into the 80s. The prog rock bands, yes, Genesis, they got bigger in the 80s in terms of how much they sold. Zappa, I think, became even more interesting in the 80s as a less than commercial, but always cult-like popular figure. And the list goes on. Roxy Music released what some say was their best album. So if you're a band big in the 70s, you could translate yourself to the 80s very, very well. But this wasn't necessarily true for 80s bands that wanted to transition into the 90s. Look at Whitesnake, born in the 70s, huge in the 80s, dead by the early 90s. And obviously they're back, but the 90s wasn't friendly to them. And now with John Bon Jovi and the rest of the guys, it was kind of like that because the sound was so quintessentially 80s. And so by the sort of early to mid 90s, their fortunes weren't as well as they were before, even though they kept going and going. But by the very early 2000s, they had a sort of renaissance. They had a rebirth because the album from the year 2000, that still sounds futuristic if you ask me, the album Crush came out, and this had It's My Life, which proved that if you know how to write anthemic music, it doesn't need to simply be part of a place and time. It can be forever. And so a band that was seemingly past its prime because the musical landscape had become much less friendly to happy, heavily produced big hair rock and roll in the early 90s. By the early 2000s, people were ready to embrace Bon Jovi once again. And from there on out, they've just become a kind of legacy act that can always sell tickets, that can always turn heads. John Bon Jovi has become an actor in all sorts of movies, TV, travels around the world. And I think they'll always be household names. But it all really started with 1987's Slippery When Wet, which really is that quintessential happy power rock album of a decade that really had lots of that kind of music. Bon Jovi did it as good, better than anyone. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.